On my graduation day, not one family member showed up. I am Caroline Mercer, and while my peers were surrounded by cheering families, I stood completely alone. The absence that stung the hardest was my mother's. She had looked me in the eye just days before and promised she would be right there in the front row. But they didn't miss my graduation because of a sudden accident or a hospital emergency. They were exactly 30 miles away, popping blue confetti at Evan's gender reveal party. They intentionally scheduled it for the exact same day, the exact same hour, knowing full well it meant they couldn't attend both. They looked at 4 years of my blood, sweat, and tears, and chose a balloon instead. I didn't cry. I didn't call them to beg for an explanation or demand their attention. I simply smiled for the cameras, walked off that stage, and went back to my empty apartment. The next morning, I opened Instagram and posted one single photo. Within exactly 1 hour, my phone screen lit up like a wildfire. 312 missed calls and texts. Frantic, panicked messages from my mother, threats demanding I take it down immediately. If you've ever had the people closest to you treat your biggest day like an inconvenience, stay with me. And if this story feels familiar, subscribe before I tell you what was in that photo. Before we get into my story, let me know what time you're watching this and what city you're from, so I know how far my story has traveled. Growing up outside Philadelphia, I learned early that Evan's moments took up more space than mine. Our affluent suburban neighborhood thrived on manicured lawns and the quiet, relentless competition of keeping up appearances. My mother, Janet, was the undisputed architect of the Mercer family image. To her, success was measured entirely in perfectly coordinated holiday cards, flawless Facebook updates, and maintaining a spotless reputation within our church community. Everything had to look exactly right, no matter what was happening behind closed doors. My father, Thomas, was a man who preferred the path of least resistance. He rarely raised an objection, finding that simply nodding quietly and letting Janet steer the ship was the easiest way to ensure peace. Evan is a few years older, and from the time we were young, the household schedule naturally dictated that his calendar came first. If he played a varsity sport, his games were non-negotiable family events. My parents would sit in the front bleachers, cheering loudly for every minor play. By contrast, my milestones were treated as afterthoughts. Whenever I brought home a ribbon from a regional science fair or earned a quiet academic award, Janet would offer a distracted smile, pat my shoulder lightly, and say, "That's nice, sweetheart. We'll celebrate later." I quickly realized that later was an empty promise, so I stopped waiting for the applause. Instead, I poured my energy entirely into my major, biomedical engineering. I harbored a deep passion for designing affordable, functional mobility devices for children with physical disabilities, a demanding field that required absolute dedication. I financed my own education by securing independent academic scholarships while splitting my remaining hours between running trials in a biomechanics lab and organizing archives at the local hospital library. I kept my achievements strictly to myself. On the rare occasions Janet asked about my day, she would wave a hand dismissively and refer to my grueling coursework as just school stuff, treating it like a temporary phase. The lopsided dynamic only solidified when Evan met Kara. She was the missing piece to my mother's perfectly curated puzzle, a woman who possessed an incredible talent for turning mundane afternoons into stunning photogenic social media spectacles. When they announced they were expecting their first child, my parents shifted into absolute overdrive. Every weekend and family dinner suddenly revolved around elaborate nursery themes and aesthetic maternity shoots. Janet viewed anything involving Evan and Kara as the ultimate family priority, leaving absolutely no room for anything else. I watched this shift from a safe distance, sharing wry observations over dining hall coffee with Tessa, a sharp-witted friend who grasped my family's reality without needing much explanation. My true anchor on campus was my advising professor, Dr. Caldwell. He was famously strict and held his students to punishingly high standards. But he was remarkably fair. In his domain, The only things that mattered were solid data and the real-world impact of our designs. The heavy workload provided the perfect excuse to stay busy as the final semester rolled forward, pushing me closer to graduation. When my graduation packet arrived, I placed the family tickets on my mother's kitchen counter. I wanted Janet to see the physical proof of my achievement. Beside the 4 premium guest passes, I laid out the folded black gown and the heavy gold honor cord representing my master's degree in biomedical engineering. I needed her to understand that this was a monumental milestone, a concrete reality, and no longer just the vague school stuff she usually dismissed. For a brief moment, she actually looked impressed. Janet picked up the embossed invitations, her eyes softening as she traced the university seal. She looked up at me and made a firm, heartfelt promise. She swore she would arrive early to secure seats right near the front row, take dozens of photos of me crossing the stage, and treat me to a celebratory dinner afterward. Thomas chimed in from the living room, muttering that he should probably check the campus parking map beforehand. It was a passive commitment, but a commitment nonetheless. I had specifically reserved the 4 passes for my parents, Evan and Kara. When I handed Evan his tickets later that week, he didn't immediately reject them. He simply tucked them into his wallet and casually mentioned, "We'll see how Kara feels that weekend." I genuinely believed they would all be there. Then, just a few days later, my phone buzzed frantically with notifications from the family group chat. Evan and Kara had officially set the date for their baby's gender reveal party. Kara flooded the thread with digital mock-ups of her Pinterest-perfect vision. Elaborate pink and blue floral arrangements, a massive tiered cake, a custom photo backdrop, catered appetizers, and a towering pastel balloon arch. My stomach dropped as I read the bold text on their digital invitation. The party was scheduled for the exact same afternoon as my commencement ceremony. The timing was entirely conflicting. It was geographically impossible to attend both. I waited for someone, anyone, to notice the glaring overlap. Nobody did. When I finally called Janet to point out the scheduling disaster, I expected her to ask Evan to shift his afternoon event by a few hours. Instead, she let out a long, heavy sigh, acting as though I were the one creating an unnecessary problem, and immediately placed the burden of compromise on me. She asked if I could just be understanding of Kara's stressful pregnancy hormones and the party vendor's strict availability. I held my ground, reminding her firmly that a master's commencement is a rigid, formal academic event involving hundreds of graduating students. I couldn't exactly ask the university administration to pause the entire ceremony just so my family could slice a cake first. Janet sounded audibly annoyed by my logic, letting out an impatient breath. She dismissed my frustration with a sharp, casual tone over the phone, uttering a phrase that made my chest tighten instantly. "You'll already have the degree either way." The conversation ended right there, establishing a deeply uneasy dynamic as the final countdown to the ceremony began. By the time the party invitations went out, the conflict stopped being about scheduling. Kara mailed glossy physical invites to the entire extended family before I could even send out a formal reminder about my commencement. The venue she selected was an upscale suburban event space located well over an hour away from the university campus, making it physically impossible for anyone to split their afternoon between the 2 locations. Janet immediately adopted a soft, coercive tone whenever the topic came up. She insisted that Evan was preparing to become a father, that Kara was dealing with incredibly sensitive pregnancy emotions, and that it was absolutely crucial for the family to show up for them right now. Thomas remained entirely silent during these discussions. When I managed to corner him in the kitchen and ask him privately where he stood, he just avoided my gaze. "Your mother is trying to keep everyone together," he muttered, effectively washing his hands of the entire situation. The ripple effect started shortly after the mail was delivered. Relatives began texting me with transparent excuses, hinting they might not make it to campus. Aunt Linda called to explicitly state she would be heading to the party because first babies are special. Cousin Rebecca sent a quick, casual apology, promising she would look at my graduation photos later. Meanwhile, Kara posted a social media story featuring a sneak peek of the venue with the caption, "So grateful the whole family is making this day unforgettable." The final piece of clarity arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in the lab when Tessa walked in, holding her smartphone. She didn't offer any sympathetic hugs or pitying looks. Instead, she simply placed her screen flat on the desk, right in front of me. It was a screenshot of Kara's private event planning group chat, forwarded to Tessa by a mutual acquaintance who was hired to help coordinate the catering. Right there in plain text, Kara had explicitly asked for the exact start time of my graduation ceremony before paying the non-refundable deposit for the venue. Evan had replied to her question with a dismissive text, claiming that his sister doesn't like attention anyway. Below that, Janet hadn't raised a single objection to the overlap. She had simply hearted Evan's message and typed, "We'll figure it out." Staring at the glowing screen, the harsh reality fully clicked into place. They hadn't forgotten the date, and they certainly hadn't double-booked the weekend by some unfortunate accident. They had actively weighed the two events, analyzed the exact timing, and consciously chosen to overwrite my milestone. I didn't confront them with the leaked screenshot or start a dramatic screaming match over the phone. Instead, I opened my messaging app and sent one brief, straightforward text directly to my parents and brother. I clearly restated the confirmed time and location of my master's commencement, adding a simple concluding sentence stating that I still sincerely hoped they would be there. I locked my phone, slid it across the lab bench, and went back to my research. As the days slipped by, not a single person replied with a clear answer. Graduation morning started with steam from the iron and my mother's name lighting up my phone. I was meticulously pressing the final stubborn creases out of my black academic gown, my heavy gold honor cord resting neatly over the back of a wooden dining chair, when the screen suddenly flashed. I answered the call, foolishly expecting a quick question about campus parking or finding the right entrance. Instead, Janet's voice came through tight, tense, and incredibly rushed. She quickly explained that Kara was in a complete state of panic because the event vendors were running severely late. Evan apparently needed the entire family at the venue for immediate damage control, which meant she and Thomas would not be making the drive to my commencement. "Mom, you promised," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously steady whisper. Janet let out a sharp, exasperated sigh, clearly annoyed that I was pushing back against the crisis. "Don't make me choose between my daughter's ceremony and my first grandchild." "You already chose," I replied evenly. "We'll take pictures another day," she offered dismissively, trying to neatly sweep her guilt under the rug before hanging up. I ended the call without another word. I didn't scream, throw the device against the wall, or collapse onto the floor to cry. I simply stood motionless in the quiet isolation of my apartment, watching the white steam rise steadily from the ironing board, letting the cold, hard reality settle firmly into my chest. 2 hours later, inside the massive university auditorium, the air was thick with nervous excitement and the loud overlapping chatter of hundreds of proud relatives. I took my place in the long alphabetical lineup of graduates. When I finally allowed myself to glance toward the specific section near the front, the premium viewing area I had explicitly reserved weeks in advance, my eyes locked onto 4 perfectly empty folding chairs. In a room overflowing with cheering crowds and standing room only capacity, that glaring physical void stood out like a physical wound. The ceremony proceeded slowly until the dean finally reached the biomedical engineering department. As I stepped toward the edge of the podium, and my name echoed loudly through the overhead speakers, there was no chaotic family uproar. There were no eager parents rushing the center aisle to take blurry photos. But from a few rows back in the middle section, Tessa suddenly stood up. She cupped her hands around her mouth, cheering fiercely and loudly enough to cut straight through the polite, standard applause. A moment later, Dr. Caldwell rose to his feet as well. He didn't shout, but he clapped with a firm, deliberate cadence. His expression carried a serious, unwavering pride that instantly anchored me as I walked across the stage to accept my degree. After the recessional, the outdoor courtyard quickly transformed into a chaotic sea of joyful family reunions and floral bouquets. I stood quietly near the edge of the brick pathway, tightly clutching my leather diploma folder. Tessa walked up beside me, entirely skipping the dramatic sympathetic hugs or long, pitying speeches. She just looked at the overwhelming crowd and stated a highly practical fact. "You don't have to go home right now." Before I could even process her suggestion, Dr. Caldwell approached us, smoothly weaving his way through the celebrating families. He adjusted his glasses, completely ignoring the celebratory noise surrounding us, and informed me with absolute certainty that there was a specific place I needed to be tonight. That evening, Dr. Caldwell drove me across Philadelphia while my gown lay folded across my lap. The city lights blurred past the passenger window, casting long shadows inside the quiet car. He offered very little explanation during the commute. When I respectfully pressed him for details about our destination, he simply kept his eyes fixed firmly on the road. He stated that I had put in enough grueling hours in the biomechanics lab to earn my undeniable right to walk into this specific room. We eventually pulled up to the imposing neoclassical columns of the historic Franklin Institute. I initially assumed we were simply attending a modest, low-key faculty reception, or perhaps a standard academic dinner for graduating engineering students. However, as the heavy wooden doors opened, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The grand hall was softly illuminated, buzzing with the focused hum of sophisticated networking. Glancing at the elegant registration tables, I quickly scanned the printed name tags. The meticulously curated guest list included chief directors from regional children's hospitals, veteran medical device engineers, and high-profile private research sponsors. We had actually walked into an exclusive private celebration hosted by the Whitcomb Pediatric Mobility Foundation. Dr. Caldwell guided me through the sophisticated crowd toward a reserved table near the front, just as a distinguished woman stepped up to the microphone. He quietly identified her as Eleanor Whitcomb. She was the organization's founder, a highly respected philanthropic figure whose mission was entirely dedicated to financing advanced, accessible mobility projects for children. After delivering a compelling, welcoming speech concerning the future of biomechanics, Eleanor paused. She looked directly toward our section and called my name over the sound system, formally requesting that I join her on the stage. My pulse hammered heavily against my ribs as I climbed the short flight of stairs. With a warm, professional smile, Eleanor officially announced to the attentive audience that I was the recipient of their premier annual fellowship for pediatric prosthetics. The details of the grant were truly staggering. She clearly stated the award amount to the room: $120,000 in direct, unrestricted research funding. Beyond the substantial financial backing, the fellowship guaranteed comprehensive relocation support and secured an immediate placement working closely alongside an elite development team specifically specializing in pediatric medical devices. As genuine applause washed over the expansive hall, I looked down at my advising professor. When I stepped off the stage holding the presentation envelope, Dr. Caldwell adjusted his glasses and finally admitted his long-held secret. He had nominated my research many months ago, meticulously submitting my prototype designs to the board. He strictly kept the rigorous process hidden because he wanted to ensure the approval was absolutely finalized before raising my expectations. Standing quietly near the polished marble columns, gripping a document that effectively launched my entire professional career, the sharp sting of the morning began to fade. The exact day my relatives deliberately walked away from my milestone had unexpectedly concluded in a magnificent room, fully surrounded by brilliant professionals who deeply understood, respected, and actively invested in the true value of my work. The next morning, I posted one photo because I wanted proof that the day had not ended in an empty row. I meticulously selected a single, unedited image captured inside the elegant grand hall of the Franklin Institute. In the background, a brilliantly lit digital display clearly showcased my name directly beneath the official title of the Pediatric Prosthetics Fellowship. I stood right in the center, still wearing the simple, formal dress from the ceremony, with my heavy black academic gown folded neatly over my forearm, a quiet, undeniable nod to the commencement event. Dr. Caldwell stood proudly on my left, while Eleanor Whitcomb smiled warmly on my right, creating a powerful, undeniable image of professional validation. I didn't write a long, bitter essay or angrily tag any family members to publicly air my grievances. I simply typed a brief, understated caption, celebrated with the people who saved me a seat. Then, I hit publish, completely bypassed the location tag, and set my device down on the kitchen counter to go make my morning coffee. Within a single hour, the screen transformed into an endless, flashing stream of frantic notifications. By the time I finally picked it up to check the lock screen, the digital badge displayed exactly 312 missed calls and texts. Janet had fired off a rapid succession of panicked messages, her tone shifting from authoritative to frantic, demanding, "Where are you? Why didn't you tell me about this?" Thomas followed up shortly after with his standard conflict-avoidant directive, "Call your mother." Evan's texts had completely pivoted away from the aesthetic triumph of his suburban baby shower. He suddenly wanted to know if this prestigious philanthropic foundation was directly connected to the high-tier medical device companies he frequently tracked in the business news. Kara, meanwhile, was in an absolute crisis over her carefully curated social media image. She sent multiple paragraphs practically begging me to alter or delete the caption entirely. She complained bitterly that mutual friends, neighbors, and church members were already forwarding the post to her, directly asking her where the Mercer family was while I was being honored. Even the extended relatives, like Aunt Linda and Cousin Rebecca, who had casually texted their flimsy excuses just 24 hours earlier, were suddenly flooding my inbox with glowing, enthusiastic messages, repeatedly claiming they were so proud of you. I stood in the quiet morning light of my apartment, slowly scrolling through the massive digital pileup. I read every single frantic word, analyzing their shifting tones, but I didn't type a reply to a single one of them. The truth was glaringly obvious. They weren't desperately trying to reach me because they felt genuine remorse for breaking their promises. They were panicking because my upload had successfully exposed their deliberate absence, instantly shattering the flawless family facade they had spent their entire lives trying to maintain. 3 days later, the photo was no longer just mine. The university's engineering department shared the image first, posting a glowing tribute to my academic journey. This was followed almost immediately by a dedicated, highly visible press release from the Whitcomb Foundation officially announcing my fellowship. The news organically circulated through expansive academic networks, regional hospital boards, medical research communities, and eventually, it seeped directly into the heart of my parents' local social circle. Members of Janet's tight-knit church group and neighborhood committee quickly began asking her incredibly awkward questions. They wanted to know why the fiercely proud mother was completely missing from such a prestigious, life-altering milestone. Janet frantically tried to control the collapsing narrative, offering a tightly rehearsed script, claiming to everyone that our family had simply celebrated separately to accommodate busy schedules. Unfortunately for her carefully constructed lie, Kara had relentlessly uploaded dozens of time-stamped social media stories from the gender reveal. Those vibrant, highly detailed posts explicitly showcased the entire extended family cheering in the suburbs at the exact hour I was standing on the auditorium stage. That glaring public contradiction quickly bled into Kara's own professional life. As a boutique planner who aggressively marketed her brand around curating perfect family-centered events, her followers found the hypocrisy deeply unsettling. The backlash was quiet but financially tangible. One prospective client, who was in the final stages of booking a lucrative baby shower, abruptly canceled their signed consultation. They sent a polite but firm email, noting they preferred to hire a coordinator who wasn't currently entangled in messy, highly publicized family drama. Evan faced a completely different, yet equally harsh professional reality check. For months, he had been actively trying to transition his corporate career into the highly competitive field of medical device sales. Scrolling through LinkedIn, he quickly realized my newly awarded fellowship placed me directly inside the elite clinical network he was desperately trying to access. His sheer audacity allowed him to send a carefully worded, overly friendly text message. He completely ignored the events of the weekend, casually asking if he could use my name in an upcoming pitch email or if I could provide a direct referral to the senior engineers on my new team. Meanwhile, Thomas contributed his usual passive interference, sending vague, guilt-tripping messages claiming that Janet was physically losing sleep over the ongoing tension. When Janet finally called me later that afternoon, her voice held absolutely zero genuine remorse. She didn't apologize for breaking her sacred promise or leaving my reserved chairs empty. Instead, she demanded that I immediately issue a public clarification to fix this situation before people get the wrong idea about us. I remained completely silent on the line, letting her ramble endlessly about damaged reputations, neighborhood gossip, and how unfair this scrutiny was to Kara's pregnancy. I had agreed to take the call solely to see if there was any lingering shred of maternal guilt buried beneath her panic. There wasn't. Her entire frantic monologue revolved strictly around preserving her flawless social facade. Sitting quietly in my living room, the absolute truth finally settled over me. They were entirely unfazed by their own cruelty. They were only devastated that their perfect masks had slipped in front of an audience,